Welcome to another of NJAPM's webinar. Before I read the title or even who is participating, we have a first for an NJAPM webinar, which is we have one of our panelists standing outside because of a technical failure inside. So this is showing you the ingenuity of some of our speakers. So, okay, so here we go. Today's webinar is titled Business Entity Options, Pros and Cons. The presenters are Elliot Ostrove and Stephan Kaplitt. Elliot Ostrove joined Epstein Ostrove LLC after practicing for more than 15 years in the complex commercial litigation department of a large regional law firm. He represents individuals and companies of all sizes in all aspects of commercial litigation in courts throughout the country, as well as in arbitration and mediation. Stephan Kaplitt is of counsel to Epstein Ostrove and handles corporate and transactional matters for the firm. He is currently a solo outside general counsel to a variety of small and medium-sized businesses, startup companies, entrepreneurs, and high net worth individuals. So welcome to both of you, and especially to you, Stephan. So with that, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you, Carl. Stephan, I'll start us off and then shortly hand it off to you since you're the
Sure.
subject matter expert. But I think today's seminar grew out of a discussion a while back on the email mailing list, where there was discussion about mediators and forming their own businesses, forming a mediation business, and what that can look like, and what thoughts should go into deciding whether when forming a mediation business, or frankly any small business, I think you should think about whether to be, say, a solo or a corporate form such as an LLC or an SCorp, or maybe something else that we haven't thought of, and that discussion on the email chat kind of led Carl to reach out to me and start talking about having a discussion about those concepts that we can all participate in. So I think I speak for both Stephan and myself when I say to everybody who's in attendance that it'll be interesting to hear your questions, and we'd love to be able to do this in a way that addresses questions that people might have. But to begin with, Stephan, I'd like to turn it over to you to talk about the corporate form in general, and things that somebody like a mediator who is starting their own business should be thinking about.
Sure. Thanks, Elliot. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Okay, great. So, and I was tempted to make a joke, standing outside, this is very lowbrow. That's why I'm of counsel, not partner at Epstein Ostrove, among other reasons. So, let me step back because sort of to cut ahead to the chase, I think for individuals, any kind of professional, anyone who's providing a service as a solo, like me actually, although I have affiliations with Epstein Ostrove, generally an LLC is probably the default entity that you'll want to use, and I'll explain a little bit why. The other alternative is an SCorp, and I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of those. But just to give a quick recap for those who might not be familiar, there are a lot of different types of corporate entities or business entities, but most of them are some variation of two basic forms, either a corporation or a partnership. And there are things like trust, which is way beyond what we're discussing today. But everything is basically either a type of corporation or a type of partnership. LLCs were developed quite a while ago. They were relatively new when I first started practicing, but they've really been around, I think, 30, 40 years, but they didn't really start to become popular until the 90s. And the reason is it combines the convenience and the ease and, to some extent, the informality of a partnership, but with the legal protections of a corporation. And so we're going to delve a little bit more into what that means. But for present purposes, I think for individual mediators who are looking to start their own business, or you may be in business as a sole proprietorship, or you may even have a different corporate entity, the default is probably a single member LLC. So let me talk about what the pros and cons of that are, and then I'll talk a little bit how they compare to an SCorp, which is what I have. So with a single member LLC, first of all, tax treatment is a pass-through. You might have heard that expression, it's a pass-through entity. And that simply means that taxation flows up through to the member. So if you've never had experience with an LLC before, essentially when you file your 1040 state tax returns at the end of the year, you will report your income and expenses on Schedule C. The LLC will be listed in your 1040, but all of that will flow through to you and be taxed as an individual. So another phrase that you might have heard in addition to pass-through entity is it's also sometimes called a disregarded entity. They're basically just two different ways of saying the same thing. So the natural question becomes, well, if there's no tax benefit, why even have it? And there are really three answers to that. The first, the most basic, is that it looks more professional. We're in 2021. The world has changed radically with social media and everything else, with technology. It looks very antiquated to have a sole proprietorship if you're doing something that's professional. It's okay maybe if, you're in sort of, a low skill level service business where you're just doing it ad hoc. But if you're a mediator, chances are you have some graduate training, and it just looks more professional to have an LLC at relatively low cost. You have startup costs to file in articles of organization or a certificate of formation. Depending on the state that you're in, you'll have either annual or biannual filing requirements. So generally the investment is probably, around $200 to start, and anywhere from $25 to $100 per year to maintain it. And for the most part, that's it. I would mention that in New York, for those of you in New York, there's a very, very odd, antiquated requirement, which I'll say a little bit about. That's called the publication requirement, which means that when you form an LLC, there's a requirement from the 90s to, or actually it probably goes further back than that. There's a requirement to actually have a hard print advertisement and notice of the formation of the LLC printed, I think, every week for 6 weeks consecutively. And to be blunt, this started out as, a kind of subsidy to the publishing business. I don't want to offend anyone who, may be affiliated with New York Publishing, but that's really what all the commentary says. There's really no obvious public need for this, certainly today, but technically it's still on the books. And if it's violated, if you fail to file a publication, which can cost from anywhere from, $500 in outer line counties like Albany, up to $1,500 if you're located in Manhattan. Technically, the failure to file publication means your LLC cannot do business in New York. As a practical matter, and Elliot, I don't know if you've seen anything more recent, but the few times the court has really looked at this in New York, the only penalty seems to be that if an LLC ends up in court, either as a plaintiff or a defendant, they cannot either file a claim or pursue a counterclaim until they've met the publication requirement. And so the last case I looked at, basically a party had to go out and publish, 10 years later, and then come back to court and say they're in good standing. So I certainly would never advise anyone, and none of this is legal advice, it's all general information. I would never advise anyone not to follow the law. but I will also tell you that the last time I looked at it about a year ago, the practical sanction or the practical penalty for not doing so seems to be pretty remote. But just so you're aware, in New York, that requirement is on the books. Many clients I've had, just don't want to take any risk, and so they file it. Others are perfectly comfortable, not filing unless there's a need in the future. Now, in other states, yes.
Stephen, I want to interrupt you for a second. We have
yes.
We have a question from Adam Berner. So Adam, I've allowed you to. I think I made it so that you can, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question so everybody can hear. Oh, okay. He's not connected to a microphone, but he did put it in his chat in the chat. So I'll read it out loud for everybody. Adam's question is: if we practice both in New York and New Jersey, can we just file LLC in New Jersey?
It's a great question. The difficulty with that, and I actually have an SCorp. I'm based in New Jersey, but I also practice in New York. And so I had to file my SCorp in New York like any other business. If you're doing business in New York or any other state, and you're going to derive income there, you're going to have to file taxes. And so you do need to file and register as a foreign entity if you form a New Jersey LLC. So as a practical matter, whether you form a New York or New Jersey LLC, if it was a New Jersey LLC and you were deriving income in New York, technically you would have to file the LLC in New York as a foreign entity, and the publication requirement would still apply. But again, to be very candid, it's a judgment call. If you're comfortable, just going ahead and filing in New York without the publication. But if you are doing business in New York, wherever your LLC is formed, you would have to file it as a foreign entity in New York, and the publication requirement would apply to that foreign LLC. Moving on, the next benefit, other than optics and looking professional and dealing with the small headaches in New York, the other benefit to doing it is that it does offer you limited liability outside of your professional services. So in other words, this gets more into Elliot's area in litigation, but if you're acting as a mediator, and I know this is pretty rare, but if you were to be sued for either malpractice or some other wrongdoing in your professional capacity, I think chances are very, very low an LLC entity would shield you. I practice as a lawyer under my PC, and my retainer agreements I sign individually and under my PC because I have malpractice insurance. And as an attorney in New York and New Jersey, I am always professionally liable for any wrongdoing or any malpractice that I hopefully will never commit. But the PC would never protect me. What it would protect me on, and it might protect you as a sole member of an LLC, is ordinary business contracts that you might enter into. For example, a lease, or a vendor agreement for IT services or cell phone. Pretty much anything that you sign in the name of the LLC, if for any reason you were to go out of business, and there was a claim for unpaid debts, unless you sign a personal guarantee, generally the LLC will shield your personal assets. The reason why I say generally is because there's also a requirement to maintain proper distinction between you individually and the LLC. So for example, if you're keeping separate bank accounts, separate checking accounts, separate credit cards, and you put all your business expenses on the cards and the bank accounts for the LLC, and you keep all your individual expenses separate, and you can document that, then it should be respected, the distinction between you and the LLC. On the other hand, if you form the LLC, but you're constantly, using the same bank account for individual and LLC expenses, or you're mixing personal expenses on your business credit card and so forth, that could give rise to a court finding that you abuse the corporate form. That's the terminology. And at that point, they might pierce the corporate veil. And for those of you who might not have heard the term, piercing the corporate veil is another sort of fancy legal term for shareholder liability. And so as a very general rule, shareholders are not liable generally for most corporate debts, with a few notable exceptions. One of them is abusing the corporate form. So that's the second benefit, that it would offer some protection of you personally for ordinary course transactions that you would enter into on behalf of the LLC. And then the third benefit is depending on your personal and family circumstances, even though it's a pass-through entity, having the LLC may give you the opportunity to take advantage of a whole range of tax benefits that may apply to you, particularly in the area of healthcare. Things are changing very radically, and there are some things that an LLC may be eligible for in terms of benefits or credits in your state or even on a federal level that a sole proprietorship might not be. We don't have PowerPoints, but I would encourage all of you to jot this down. It's something that I only learned about very recently. There's something called an HRA 105. It's a medical expense account that, if you qualify and if you do it the right way, essentially allows you to treat as a business expense almost all of your medical costs. And those of you who are in New Jersey know that there's a 7.5% threshold, or actually it's federal. In New Jersey, there is no threshold, but on the federal level, I think you can only deduct medical expenses above 7.5%, I believe, of AGI. But the trick with HRA 105 is it doesn't apply to people who are only self-employed. So you might not be eligible. It took me hours of getting the wrong information to discover that. Sure, I'll repeat it in a second. It took me hours of getting bad information, researching, to discover that apparently, as a sole employee in my SCorp, I'm not eligible for an HRA 105, but I'm still not positive. The site, it's not a site, but they're called H as in hotel, R as in Robert, A as in Apple 105 plans. And if you just Google them, you can do your own research, maybe ask your accountant. It does not seem to be widely known. Yes, HRA 105 medical expense account. So I'm not suggesting that, hey, go form an LLC and you can all form an HRA 105 and get pre-tax benefits. I'm just saying that there may be things that make you eligible as a single member LLC that you might not be eligible for as a sole proprietor. And in addition, and again, I'm still researching this myself, there may be benefits. For example, if you form an LLC and make your spouse or one of your family members an employee, assuming your accountant agrees with that it's proper and that they're actually doing work for the entity, that in itself may make you eligible for certain benefits like an HRA 105. So those are pretty much the three main benefits. Now I want to talk briefly how an LLC compares to an SCorp. The short answer is that an SCorp allows you to essentially pay yourself a salary, reasonable compensation, which is what the IRS requires, and therefore treat a portion of your income as distributions or dividends, where you would get a K1, and so you would save federal and state payroll taxes on that portion of your income. Now, one thing to be very mindful of is there's been a fair amount of litigation. The IRS is very watchful of, particularly self-employed professionals who, will take, 5 or 10% of their income as salary, issue themselves a W-2, and then take, 85, 90, 95% as a distribution. And the IRS has gone after that because the IRS code requirement is that you have to pay yourself reasonable compensation. And obviously there's a lot of subjectivity built into that. But the informal rule of thumb, not from the IRS, but from accountants, practitioners, the informal rule of thumb is that reasonable consideration, ideally should be, anywhere from 40 to 50% of your income, depending on the circumstances. If you have a bad year or high expenses, it could be justified as low as, maybe 25%. But just be mindful that the lower that percentage of W-2 income is, the higher the risk that the IRS may audit you. And if there's a determination that you underpaid yourself W-2 income, it could subject you to penalties, interest, and so forth for underreporting income. So that's the risk. And I'm told, I'm just repeating hearsay, but one accountant who's very versed in this area has said to me, no, they don't care about SCorps. They only focus on LLCs and Schedule C income. So what he was implying is that the IRS is even more watchful of that reasonable compensation standard with an LLC rather than an SCorp. I personally don't understand why it would make a difference, because either it's reasonable compensation or it isn't, and it can be argued whether any particular amount is reasonable for that person under those circumstances. But for whatever it's worth, one accountant who has a lot of experience in the area told me they're more watchful of Schedule C and sole member LLC filers than SCorp. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say about LLCs. I can talk about other corporate entities, but as I said in the outset, for mediators who are going into business on their own or with maybe one or two other mediators, it would almost always make sense to use an LLC or possibly an SCorp. I can't think of any circumstance where it would make sense to use another form of entity, whether it's a C corporation, which is just a regular corporation, or a general partnership. And I can go into details if anyone would like, but there would be no benefit to doing that and a lot of disadvantages. So with that, Elliot, I was going to talk a little bit more about liability, but if you'd like to jump in, that's more in the litigation area. And of course, if there are questions, one of the hopes that we have for this session is to really make it, more of a conversation based on questions or anything that you'd like us to amplify on.
Stephen, let me ask you a question before turn it over to Elliot, which is, what are the disadvantages of using an SCorp?
The disadvantages are that it's technically a corporation, so there may be higher filing fees. I mean, I certainly pay a fair amount in New York and New Jersey. It's a more complicated tax return. It's not a pass-through, so I probably pay, $1,000 a year more for having an SCorp that has to file an 1120S and I forgot what it is in New Jersey, a CBT 200, I think, and in New York, I forgot the name of the form. But the main disadvantage is just the formality, the need to do far more tax returns, treat it like a corporation, at least for tax purposes. I will say something very candid. It's a bit of a confession, and I know this is being recorded. I generally do my best to keep everything separate, but I'm not as diligent or studious. Sometimes I'll pay things out of a personal account and then record it. And it is a proper business expense, but I don't write a lot of business checks. The reason why I don't worry about it is because I don't sign anything only in the name of the PC. It's not a significant concern, but I would certainly recommend clients and others to keep a very strict separation as much as possible in the event that you do enter into contracts that are meant to only be for the LLC or the SCorp. But the main disadvantage of the SCorp is really the tax filings and the regulatory filings at a state level, because you are a corporation.
Is an SCorp something that a solo mediator can do himself or herself, or is it something you're going to need to get an attorney to do? Whereas I know for an LLC, you can just do it yourself.
Yeah, forming it is pretty easy. I mean, now there's legal Zoom.
Uh-oh.
Sorry.
All right.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. You know, I think I'm having a medical issue. I've got to hang up. I apologize.
Well,
Well,
okay. Well,
Can you
we're,
call an ambulance, please? Can you call an ambulance, please? Can you call an ambulance, please?
okay. Elliot, this has been a surprise today.
yes.
So let's hope he is well. But let's go on.
Okay. I guess what we were starting to turn to was briefly was some discussion about liability and trying to limit liability through the corporate form. And so I would start talking briefly about liability from two perspectives. One is liabilities that are taken on by the entity itself. And I think we can, Carl, you'll
I don't think he was asking us to call it because I don't even know where he is.
Yeah, he was somewhere in Manhattan, on a street in Manhattan.
Yeah, so I think he was talking to someone next to him.
Right.
So
from a liabilities perspective, we can think about things from I guess the way I think about it is in sort of the two buckets of things that are solely done by the corporations or the corporate entities, such as entering into a lease with a landlord for office space, buying furniture, incurring other debts that are needed for purposes of running the office. And then there's the professional services that we provide, and whether any of our clients can sue us for the provision of those services. Thinking about the latter first, I'm not familiar, and Carl, maybe you've heard of this before, but I don't know that I have. I've really heard of somebody suing a mediator for professional negligence, and frankly, I'd find that probably hard for somebody to do. So I'm not sure that there's a real true concern. I mean, of course, anything's possible, but I'm not sure there's a real true concern about liability from a professional standpoint. That being said, having liability insurance that covers that should be able to protect you. And then, as the person just put in the chat about ease of getting liability insurance, I would agree with that. As a corporate entity, you might have an easier time getting liability insurance that can cover those professional issues. With respect to,
let me just interrupt. Jay, if you would raise your hand, then you can talk about all your points rather than putting them into chat. So as soon as Elliot's done, we'll turn to you and you can make your points.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so from the perspective of thinking about things that the corporate entity does, such as entering into a lease for office space or office equipment, or even making purchases that might be paid over time, the corporate entity or the corporate structure, such as an LLC, should provide some protection to the individual behind the entity in the event that those things cannot be paid for, or you find yourself on the corporate entity on hard financial times. And so there is a significant benefit to having an entity in order to protect yourself from those types of liabilities. But Jay, you were listing some great points in the chat there, and so we'll give you an opportunity to jump in at this point and say
okay.
what.
Thank you. I thought I could keep typing without interfering, but in any event, what I did is organized myself as a single member LLC in New Jersey when I began my business. Of course, I found the organization to be easier. There are less filings, as was said. I also have a separate checking account just for the LLC. So all my income and expenses relative to the LLC come out of that checkbook. And I do that purposely because if the LLC is audited, I don't want to give the IRS a personal checkbook. I let them see the business checkbook and only the business items that relate to the business. Also, rather than having an S corporation where you would have to do a projection at the end of the year to determine what the profit is, so to make sure you've taken a reasonable salary, the LLC income is all ordinary income subject to self-employment tax. So that I don't know really if you're saving a whole lot of money because the speaker said 40-50. I've seen the rates higher, more like 80-20. And the IRS at one point, I don't know if they still do, was doing an analysis of S corporations to see where, how they did their computations. I don't know if the IRS is still having that that panel. What else can I say? In terms of insurance, I had no problem getting several $100,000 of liability insurance, which is all I need based upon the cases, the values of the cases that I've been mediating. And in terms of protection from the personal, it's my belief that if you're an LLC, a single member LLC, and you're sued, that they're going to go after you anyway, irrespective of the LLC. So I don't really know that having an LLC will stop that. Because if you have the, sub-S will stop that, because if you have the sub-S, they'll go through the SCorp and try to pierce the veil anyway, at least in the litigation. So these are things that, you consider. It's just the overall cheapness of maintaining an LLC relative to the S corporation. There's one more layer of tax returns you have to do at least. And I don't know what the costs are, because in Jersey, they used to have a rule where you'd have to pay a flat amount by the number of stockholders. But I don't know if those rules are still in effect anymore in the LLC, in the sub-S ruling of filings for New Jersey. So that's all I wanted to make those points.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. So first of all, I wanted to say, well, while Jay was talking, I did call Stephan. He did answer the phone, and he said he thinks he's okay. He's not quite sure what happened to him. He was standing there and talking, and as you saw him kind of tumble a little bit, or the camera move, he said he felt like his legs kind of like collapsed out from under him, and he's not really quite sure why that happened. But he's sitting at the moment. There is an ambulance on the way, and it just so happens that his brother is a doctor in a local hospital, a hospital that's local to where he is. So he's going to go to the hospital and see his brother. So, but he sounded like he was doing okay.
So let's talk some more about the liability part
Sure.
of an LLC. First, the professional part. I think we all, at least I think, that you're not going to get very much protection from an LLC. Plus, as you were talking about, I don't know of any mediators who have been sued. And I think probably because as mediators, we send people away with documents that aren't signed, aren't binding, and they, after being advised to see attorneys, see other people, et cetera, they do their own thing and make it binding. So I think that's one of the primary reasons, is we're not really sending them away with anything that we have been part of and that's signed. But nevertheless, I think all of us should, or probably do, have liability insurance, which is really cheap for mediators. For lawyers, it's probably part of your regular legal malpractice insurance, but if you're not one, I used to buy it when I was practicing. It's under $400 a year, And what I was always concerned about was not anyone winning a lawsuit, but enough money to pay my legal fees, right? Which could be substantial, right?
Yeah,
Elliot,
absolutely.
you probably get involved in that. How much could legal fees run if you were sued as some sort of professional?
Yeah, it's obviously it's hard to say when when you're talking about legal fees sort of in a vacuum and not really knowing what it is. But even if you were to be able to get out of a case on a motion to dismiss right at the beginning of the case, which is frankly relatively rare, you're still talking $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 in legal fees, for just that. And it probably increases exponentially if you're unable to get out on a motion and actually have to participate in the discovery process. So agreed with you that there's probably little risk for a mediator from a professional liability standpoint, ultimately, but there is a need for protection in the just in case. The question. The answer to the question of can you be sued is always yes, right? The possibility that they can win against you is a much different answer that from a mediator liabilities perspective.
Okay, so would that also be true for, let's say, slip and fall? You rent an office, you do it out of your home or wherever. I mean, theoretically, would you be protected in an LLC? And even if it were theoretically possible that might happen, wouldn't you buy insurance? I mean, aren't you going to get all the insurance you can possibly get to protect yourself, regardless of what liability you think you might have?
Right. That I think that's always the best advice is to have the insurance that's available to you for to protect you in a just in case. I mean, that's essentially what insurance is, right? Is just in case something happens. So, for example, you have an office where you conduct mediation and somebody slips and falls in that office. I think about the liability discussion from two different perspectives. If somebody just happened to slip and fall, in your office due to whatever it might be, the office layout, or there was something sticking up, or they tripped over their own feet, or the floor was slippery because somebody had waxed it recently, whatever the case may be, but it's sort of the typical office layout, that there may be some significant protection as a result based on your corporate structure at that point. And then the reason why I say may is because even within the corporate structure, one is always responsible for your own actions, right? And so if the person who slipped and fell pointed the finger at you and said, Elliot, you're the one who put that briefcase in the middle of the hallway, and that's what I tripped over. And I watched you, I saw that you did it, but only after it was too late. Then I might be personally liable for my personal actions, even if I did it within the context of my role as the mediator, for lack of a better way of describing it. That being said, if there's liability insurance, or better way to say it is, that's what you have liability insurance for, right? Is to control for situations like that. I see that there's a question in the chat about a beginning mediator with minimal business and whether it's better off just doing a DBA. It's hard to say. I think that the advantages of having a single member LLC likely outweigh the disadvantages of having it, or the setup costs. If you're a single member LLC, it's relatively simple to set up. You can probably do it yourself. If you have the assistance of an accountant, a lot of accountants will do it for you for minimal costs. And I think that there's probably more benefits to having that set up than disadvantages to having it. And so my thought process is that it's better to have it even as a single member LLC rather than having a DBA. Frankly, that's just my personal opinion. A lot of this, and well, a lot of the things that Stephan was talking about, and as he was talking, are tax-driven type decisions or allocation of income type decisions. And so some of this, and when deciding the best corporate form to think about using, and whether to use one or the other, or one at all versus just say a sole proprietorship and DBA, I think it's important that you at least run some of the questions that you have by an accountant who's going to be able to give you advice on that front, since a lot of these decisions are driven by tax and income allocation.
Yeah, when I started my mediation business, it was like 2001. I don't think that a single member LLC was permitted, but if do you know whether
it's a more recent construct, so you might be right.
When I formed it, I had to form the traditional one, and I got to tell you, over the years it became a gigantic pain, because I had to file partnership return, K1, all kinds of things, and it was a gigantic paperwork mess. And it was just tedious every year. And then sometime I got caught because they changed the federal filing date from April 15th to March 15th, and just a mess. With a single member, I've certainly changed my mind that it seems like it's so easy to do it that there's no reason not to do it, almost. And let me mention one thing that I think is really important, which is a corporate, your name. When I filed it, I had New Jersey Mediation Group. All right. Now, if I had just said, Carl Cangelosi doing businesses, Carl Cangelosi mediator, might be different. But getting protection for the name was important, and it's something I think it's difficult to do if you're operating as a sole proprietorship.
I think you're right. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you're right, Carl. It's a good point. And one of the, when we think about building our businesses, it's something that I think it's important to keep in mind. So, switching gears for a moment from a liability perspective to more focused on a marketing perspective, and giving you the opportunity to stand out. Forming a corporate entity and registering that corporate entity with the state of New Jersey gives you the protection that, or should give you the protection that nobody else will be able to use that same name in marketing in marketing themselves, right? And so you will be, the state of New Jersey won't allow a second entity with that same name to be formed in the state of New Jersey. And so it will give you some exclusivity in the marketplace in using your name, and should be able to give you some advantage in doing your marketing and getting your name out there.
Yeah, and you certainly want to protect your name nowadays, at least on a statewide basis, because with Zoom, more and more people are practicing it, and your clients are everywhere.
Right.
And so when you had to do DBA, you might not have been worrying about people in other states using the same name. But I know that Andrew Jasani had an issue using divorce with dignity. Someone else in another state was using that, and they had a go around about her use of divorce with dignity. So since everything now is pretty much multi-state, you could have clients anywhere. it seems prudent to protect your name as best you can.
And just to address Adam's question just posted there, I don't think that filing a DBA provides any name protection at all. I think it provides a registration so that there's a way there's basically a paper trail for somebody to find you or find who is behind the DBA name if that's necessary. But from an affirmative protection standpoint, I'm not familiar with any protection that a DBA name would afford you. I think there was one question that I missed. Janine had posted a question about having a credit card in her own name, notwithstanding the fact that she uses it for LLC expenses. And so I think there are two aspects of that question to think about. One is from a corporation and tax perspective. I think that's, whether the credit card is in your own personal name or whether it's in your company's name, so long as the expenses are being done for the company or for the benefit of the company. My understanding is that you and your accountant can work that out in a way that there's a proper tax allocation for those expenses so that it doesn't hurt you. So from that perspective, that, from a liability standpoint, that's an accountant question that I think is relatively easy to answer. From a personal liability standpoint, the thing that I think about is that if for some reason the entity itself runs out of money and cannot pay for the costs that have been accumulated on that credit card, the fact that the credit card is in your own personal name gives the credit card company the ability to go after you personally for those expenses. While if you were able to get a credit card that was just in the company's name, there might be some limit on the credit card company's ability to go after you personally. Now, I think we probably, a lot of us probably have had the experience that in order to get a credit card, especially for a small company, the credit card company wants your personal name on it also just for that reason. So it may not ultimately make a difference one way or the other from a personal liability standpoint, but it is something to think about if you're there, if you've been in business long enough, or if you're able to work out with a credit card company, the opportunity to have just your business be on the card instead of you personally as well.
Right. I was thinking of one point that was made during the listserv discussion, and I think it was Felicia who said that one of the advantages she liked about an LLC was that you could use an EIN rather than Social Security. But when I did some research on that, I understand an individual can get an EIN number as well. I mean, so if you do want to go with a sole proprietorship, you can get an EIN and do not have to use your Social Security number.
Interesting. I didn't know that, but that's
yeah. So,
does anybody else have any other questions?
I see one raised hand. Let's see, where is it? It's Jay. Jay again.
Go ahead, Jay. I've
that comment you made about the sole practitioner getting an EIN. I think that's true. I believe there's a limit to what it could be used for, primarily for payroll tax reporting. I think with the 1099, they'd have to give the Social Security number, whereas if you had an LLC with an EIN, you can give the EIN number for the 1099, which is the fees that you'll be receiving from your clients.
Well, I just Googled it briefly a while ago, so maybe.
I haven't looked at the rules lately, but those are the rules as I understood them.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert. I suggest everyone else Google it if you're interested. If you're a sole proprietorship and you want to get an EIN, go Google it and find out.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of asking my accountant questions when it comes to things like this. I understand some of my own limitations. Notwithstanding my thought that of my ability to read IRS publications, but I think it's a good idea to confirm with your accountant questions like that.
Right. Okay, so any other questions? Have we run through the whole chat?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much, Elliot. And
thank
if you would, when you think it's appropriate, give Stephen a call, find out what happened, and would you let us know by putting it onto the listserv?
Of course, I'll be happy to. I'll check in with Stephen a little later today and make sure he's okay. And I will send an email to everybody letting them know what the story is.
So if there are no further questions, I really want to thank you. I think this is a really good follow-up on the listserv discussion, because that, the nature of the listserv is, some people give an answer, it may not be totally correct, and you never get a complete answer to the whole, never get the complete picture. So I want to thank you very much. And
my pleasure. Thank you for asking us to.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Bruce Matez wants to know what the attendance code is. Bruce, this is not a CLE webinar. So I'll give you a code, but you don't need it. Okay. So everyone have a great time. And I won't see you again until, let's see, January 10th is our next CLE webinar. And it is ethics program. So if I'll be sending something out a couple of weeks before that, and I may have another one in early January 3rd. So everyone have a happy holidays and take care.
You too. Thank you. Take care, everybody.